Over the course of modern history, the evolution of democracy amongst developed Western nations can be measured by the analysis of landmark events like the 1975 constitutional crisis in Australia and the January 6 Capitol attacks in America. Certain traits of the system, like leadership spills in Australia and election challenges in the US, and precedents set by a higher authority, for example the High Court in Australia and Supreme Court in the US, and the constitutions of both nations. An analysis of factors that influence democracy can provide an insight into how the system has been refined in Western liberal democracies like Australia and the United States. Arguably, the main influence on democracy is the media. The main focus of this video report will be covering the monopolization and radicalization of mainstream media in both nations and its effect on democracy, as well as providing an answer to the question of which system is more effective. The 2000 election was arguably one of the biggest hurdles American democracy has faced in recent years. The result was George Bush winning the presidency by 537 votes, a 0.009% margin. Bush's opponent, Democratic nominee and former Vice President Al Gore, required the electoral votes from the state of Florida, where Bush was leading by this extremely narrow margin. Gore challenged the result and demanded a recount in the Florida Supreme Court. The Bush campaign brought the issue of the election to the U.S. Federal Supreme Court, demanding they overruled the Florida Supreme Court's decision to recount the votes. The historically conservative Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bush, stopping the counting of votes and rendering all recounted votes from the 3 days prior illegitimate. Gore was capable of appeal. However, to uphold democratic integrity, he conceded the election and Bush won the presidency by 537 votes. The 2000 election is commonly referred to as a flaw in the American democratic system and an argument in favor of the abolition of the Electoral College, as Al Gore won the majority vote nationwide. The adoption of a system like Australia, where citizens vote for local representatives for federal parliament rather than one candidate, as well as establishing mandatory voting, would likely reduce political stalemates as seen in 2000 and 2016. Over the last few decades, the increased political polarization amongst the media, voting citizens, and Congress has been undeniable. Republicans in Congress are seen to consistently vote against Democrat-based legislation, despite it often benefiting the lives of the citizens they represent. This increased lack of bipartisan effort in Congress mainly came about after Barack Obama's election, further shifting the Republican Party to right-wing politics. The shift to a partisan Congress was most apparent during the Donald Trump administration, with Republicans further to the right aligning themselves with Trump and consistently voting against Democratic legislation, even going as far as branding more centrist Republicans, like former presidential candidate Mitt Romney and former Secretary of State Colin Powell, as RINOs, which stands for Republican in name only, further establishing the party as right-wing. In recent years, the height of political polarization among citizens has peaked. Notable events like the 2020 presidential election and the January 6 Capitol attack prove this. Studies conducted by Pew Research Center dive deeper into the state of America's political polarization by surveying groups of voting citizens on their position on current issues. Results on highly politicized issues like the COVID outbreak and universal health care showed that 24% of Trump voters believed that controlling the COVID outbreak was of high priority, in contrast to 82% of Biden voters believing it should be of high priority. Another survey conducted by Pew Research shows the percentage of voters who believe their government has handled the COVID outbreak well. Results for both the US and Australia are present. The US results show that 76% of Republican voters believe that the Trump administration handled the COVID outbreak well, whereas in Australia, 98% of Liberal voters believe that the Liberal government and under Scott Morrison handled the COVID outbreak well. Interestingly, 93% of Labour voters also believe that the Liberal government handled the outbreak well. This goes to show the extent of polarization in the US compared to Australia, which is almost non-existent amongst voting citizens. The recent repeal of landmark decision Roe v. Wade by the US Supreme Court brought further mainstream attention to the Supreme Court and its observed bias. The judicial system in the US is intended to be nonpartisan. However, the system at which judges are appointed to the Supreme Court prevents this. The US Constitution empowers the President to nominate potential judges of the Supreme Court with the confirmation from the Senate. Republicans have held a majority in Congress since 2014, allowing for the appointments of more centrist and conservative judges, under the presidencies of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. The recent nomination of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was met with much scrutiny from Republicans in the Senate. Currently, the Supreme Court is composed of 6 justices appointed by and aligned with conservatives, including Chief Justice John Roberts, while only 3 justices have been appointed by Democrats. Similarly to the US, in Australia, justices are appointed by the Governor-General on the advice of the Prime Minister. The High Court of Australia, as of 2022, is also skewed to the right, with 5 justices appointed on the advice of Liberal Prime Ministers and 2 on the advice of Labor Prime Ministers. This is likely due to the almost decade-long Liberal majority government under 3 Prime Ministers. Arguably the greatest threat to American democracy is the dangerous radicalization of mainstream media. Many point to the political polarization of the media as the cause of voter radicalization. The boundary between fact and opinion content is no longer present. The radicalization of the media began after the 1987 repeal of the FCC Fairness Doctrine. This doctrine, introduced in 1949, was installed to keep journalistic standard in check by ensuring mainstream print news and eventually televised news presented all possible sides to controversial issues. In 1985, FCC Chairman Mark S. Fowler, a close associate of the Republican President Ronald Reagan, argued that the Fairness Doctrine and other associated acts like the personal attack rule infringe on the First Amendment right to free speech. Fowler's successor, also appointed by Reagan, Dennis R. Patrick, took the issue through multiple court cases which inevitably resulted in its revocation. The revocation of the Fairness Doctrine led to the current situation where opinion is indistinguishable from fact and bias to right-wing extremism is commonplace. The most common is arguably Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, as well as Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire and Alex Jones' InfoWars. All shows aim to promote the Republican agenda and frequently denounce gun reform, abortion, movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and more. The main fundamental difference between the US and Australia's governmental system is that the United States is a republic with the president as a head of state, whereas Australia is a constitutional monarchy with the Crown as a head of state, who is represented by the Governor-General. The Prime Minister of Australia's role as the head of government does not have the same authority as the head of state. This was demonstrated in 1975, where the Governor-General, John Kerr, dismissed the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. This landmark moment in Australian history solidified the power of the Crown through the Governor-General and is commonly used in talking points both for and against the Australian Republic. Many argue that the Crown and the Governor-General should remain head of state, as they are, in theory, entirely non-partisan. Many theories surrounding the crisis suggest that Kerr was contacted by the CIA and Buckingham Palace over Whitlam's more nationalistic approach to governing, notably the planned nationalisation of Australia's industries and natural resources, and the removal of American military bases. The nationalisation of Australia's industries and natural resources would have drastically decreased Australia's reliance on trade partners, namely the US, while contributing to social programs, like the Whitlam government's cancellation of university fees and the introduction of Medicare. Australian Republicans and supporters of Whitlam argue that if Whitlam was not restricted by the Crown, Australia would have greatly benefited from his policies. However, an Australian republic would likely require a rework of our system of government similar to that of the US, which many citizens, regardless of party, are against. Leadership spills in Australian Parliament are damaging to democracy and destabilise leadership. Leadership spills occur in Parliament when an MP or multiple MPs challenge the incumbent leader of their own party. A vote is then held by members of the party and a new leader is chosen. Over the last 9 years of coalition government, there have been 4 leadership spills in the Liberal Party and 2 in the National Party, resulting in 3 changes of leadership, from Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull to Scott Morrison. This is troubling as it shows a partisan shift in Parliament as factions are formed within parties, with Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison and incumbent opposition leader Peter Dutton all from the more conservative branch of the Liberal Party, while Malcolm Turnbull is more centrist. The Labour Party suffers from this too, as their factions, Labour Left and Labour Right respectively, have transitioned through prime ministers, notably Bob Hawke to Paul Keating in 1991, Kevin Rudd to Julia Gillard in 2010. These internal party feuds damage the reputation of the sitting government as it signifies internal party instability. Arguably the biggest threat to Australian democracy is the increasing polarisation of mainstream media. Australia is a victim of Rupert Murdoch's media monopoly. Currently, Murdoch owns the majority of well-known and highly circulated print media, not limited to The Australian, The Daily Telegraph, Herald Sun, Sunday Mail, The Advertiser, and more. Murdoch expanded into television with Sky News, which is comparable to the US Fox News, both launched in 1996. Murdoch's platforms exist to promote his political ambitions in Australia. In recent years, Murdoch and his media monopoly have been the target of a royal commission headed by former Labour Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, with support from former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Both former Prime Ministers faced enormous unjustified criticism during their tenure from Murdoch's outlets, which, alongside internal party opposition, resulted in a tank in their approval ratings and leadership skills. Both the US and Australian democracies are affected by bias media in some form. Australia, while having a largely monopolised media, does not suffer from the same polarisation among citizens as seen in the US. This can be attributed to the US's more radicalised media and its ease of access. Right-wing talk shows on Fox News are free to air, unlike Australia's alternative Sky News, which is pay TV exclusive. The majority of free-to-air news on Australian television is relatively non-partisan, despite key officials within TV networks being aligned with the Liberal Party, notably Peter Costello, former Treasurer under John Howard, being the chairman of Nine Entertainment. It is important to consider the differences in the democratic processes of each nation. As previously mentioned, Australia is a constitutional monarchy, whereas the US is a republic. The US President is both head of government and head of state, while in Australia the Prime Minister is head of government and the reigning British monarch, who is represented by the Governor-General, is head of state. This provides a further division of power, which many Australian Republicans argue is a flaw in Australian democracy, while monarchists argue it is necessary to maintain a division of power. The means by which the Prime Minister and President are elected are also different, with the Prime Minister being decided by whichever party has the majority of seats in the House of Representatives, while the US President is directly elected by the people regardless of seats in the Congress. This, in theory, can heavily limit the President's authority. For example, during the majority of Bill Clinton's presidency, both houses in Congress had a Republican majority, heavily limiting his ability to pass promised legislation. To some extent, the same political stagnation can occur in Australia, in the Senate. For example, during the 1975 constitutional crisis, the House of Representatives under Gough Whitlam pushed legislation enforcing his platform of economic nationalization and greatly improved Social Security. The Senate, under a coalition majority, blocked Whitlam's supply bills, which would fund the promised government expansion. The opposition used this as a means to force an election, which resulted in the Governor-General's dismissal of Whitlam. Based on the analysis of historical events that shaped the democratic processes of Australia and the US, it is safe to conclude that the Australian democratic system is overall more stable and effective compared to that of the United States. This conclusion was reached mainly due to the lesser extent of polarization and radicalism among citizens and the media in Australia. Australia has achieved a system of truly representative government with mandatory voting, whereas in the US an average of 55% of eligible citizens vote, which under the principles of representative government does not meet the standards required. While the Australian democratic process has its flaws, the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. The flaws of the US system show a dangerous level of political polarization while also having less checks and balances regarding the concentration of power in the office of the President, while Australia's division of power is sparse, as power is shared amongst the Governor-General, the Prime Minister, and frontbench MPs. To conclude, the direct answer to the question, to what extent is the Australian democracy more effective compared to that of the United States, and which system is more preferable, is that Australia has the more effective and preferable democratic system.